Well, thank you everybody for joining our talk today about a defensible CMMC program and the False Claims Act. So I'll introduce myself and then I'll hand it over to Doug. So my name is Greg Peterson. I'm a principal consultant at a company called RKON. We focus on cloud security compliance, and we really focus on a lot of federal work with CMMC and FedRAMP. And so I've been doing IT for about 30 years, about 25 of it in security. And Doug, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Greg. Pleasure to join you today as well. I'm Doug Barbin, president at Chillman & Company and national managing partner here. I've been with Chillman for over 16 years, a variety of roles in starting services, overseeing all of service delivery. Key focus of late has been CMMC and the work that we're doing in the federal and the DoD, DOW space. And so, yeah, excited to be here and talk about this particular topic. The False Claims Act. We're not here to give you a legal briefing per se. We're also not here to scare you. I think what you see here on this platform on LinkedIn a lot of times is you better do this or else, type of things. And I think that the nuance of what we're going to get to and talk to here is when we talk about a defensible security and compliance strategy, it is when something happens, when someone asks questions or starts poking, what's your defense? Like, in your defense should be a good foundation of a program, right? And so that's what we're going to talk about, looking beyond the checkbox mentality to what is a truly robust CMMC, insert any other kind of compliance, but we're talking here about CMMC in the context of the False Claims Act and DFARS. And so, Greg, I'll fire off the first question to you. I mean, when a defense contractor first engages you for CMMC, how often do you think they're thinking about this topic of defensibility versus I need to get certified to check this box to win this contract, right? Type of mentality. So.
Sure, Doug. So most of the time when we see clients come in, recently, the rules on CMMC have changed, and so now you actually have to go through a C3 POW and get an assessment where people were doing self-assessments previously. And this is bringing a lot of attention to people on, somebody's actually going to check what I write down and then certify me. So the big concern we see right now is either they've self-assessed and they really want to validate before they have an assessor come in, or they haven't even self-assessed and it's a new one coming into them. Always the main concern is how quickly can I get the certification, because I'm contractually obligated to get a certification.
Sure.
What they're not really thinking about is what you just said, is the defensibility throughout the entire project and program on this case. So when they come in, they think this is a point in time assessment like an ISO 27001 or SOC 2, and they don't think their way through, even though those programs require you to continue the maintenance of it throughout the year. Most people just see it as a checkpoint when they come in. And what we really try to get people to understand, especially when they come in for advisory services, is this is a shift on how you do business. It's not a project, we're going to get CMMC and the project's done. This is more of a program base. You're going to have to start a program and move your way through the program from this point on, as long as you're CMMC. You're going to have to prove over time that what happens in the audit, which might be 1 or 2 weeks, is happening the other 50 weeks of the year. And when the Department of Justice is looking at any of these False Claims Acts, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but they're looking at the entirety of what you're doing. They're not just looking at when you're assessed on there. Any thoughts on that, Doug?
Yeah, so let me pull on that just a little bit. So are you implying that in certain cases, passing a C3 PAO audit could create a false sense of security, right? Or a false sense of compliance, right? Because it's even the audit itself, even the CMMC audit itself exists at a point in time and is an every 3-year thing, right? So, so how do you look at things like annual affirmations and so forth? Is that where you're getting at from kind of the programmatic and the defensibility piece of it?
To an extent, yes.
Yep.
So obviously you're going to have your annual affirmations. You're going to go in and say you're doing it. Somebody's going to sign. We'll talk about signing on these as well.
Yep.
But really, it's a fundamental shift. So when you go through CMMC, there's 110 controls. Some of the controls are, let's just talk logging and monitoring. You're supposed to continue to prove that you have logging and monitoring meeting the schedule that's defined in there throughout the entire year.
That's right.
You're not, and most people will look and say, okay, we have it now, but are we doing this? There's some quarterly things you may have to do. There's some things that you must continue to document throughout the entire year to prove you're doing it. A lot of people will look at it as a program. We've got CMMC now, we're good. And they stop funding or paying attention to all the evidence, because ultimately it comes down to evidence. And if something happens and they come after you, documentation is your friend. Nobody loves documentation, but it is your friend.
That's right. Because a prime who could challenge you or report you to your point to DOJ, right? They're going to come in X number of months after, even if you were able to quote unquote survive and have a clean audit as of that point in time, right? You may get looked at X months down the road. And to your point, if you stopped logging the day after the auditor left, you're probably going to be in trouble, right? Type of thing. And I think that's an important aspect to this, because it is the exactly point that you've been making, is that if you are called to the carpet by DOJ or elsewise, they're not just going to look at the assessment that was done, right? They're going to look at what you've done since then, excuse me, and what you continuously do, right? So
that's fair. This is a program. This is not just a single project.
Okay.
Well, Doug, I'm going to throw a question off you. So,
sure.
Like to do parallels with other programs. So HIPAA's out there, Health Insurance Portability and Affordability Act, and it has audited programs that still collapse. So if there's the Department of Health and Human Services comes in and looks at you after a breach, they can see that the programs are not fully compliant on there. So just using that as an example, most people have heard of HIPAA. As an auditor, what lessons do you think a CMMC program should be taking from that?
Yeah, I mean, there's some stark differences, as you know, right? Like CMMC has a certification, HIPAA doesn't really. I mean, there's high trust and there's other mechanisms to prove adherence. But here's the interesting thing. I've always been in the camp, even going back to PCI. Having a compliance program doesn't guarantee that an incident isn't going to occur. I mean, if it was, the compliance requirements wouldn't include incident response plans and logging and things like that, right? So I think that what we've seen in the learning from HIPAA, and in particular the OCR audits that HHS has done, and they do typically come in after there's been a breach, after there's been something that's occurred. In many cases, yes, to your point, they identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities that should have been addressed, that were ultimately the root cause of the incident. In other instances, they're coming in and they're looking and they're seeing, okay, you did have a program, you did have an incident response plan. This was a sophisticated actor. You responded the best way you could have potentially, responded, right? And then as a result, you kind of follow the reasonableness approach to say, yeah, you've got a defensible position. So look at my program, look at the logging, look at my incident response, look at what we did. But also imagine what would have happened if we didn't have that program in place, right? And I think that's a very important parallel here, because if something happens, or even if it's just a challenge, right, you're going to get asked these questions as to what you had in place to reasonably kind of protect yourself. So.
Right. And I have a big background in PCI as well. And I've seen companies go through a PCI assessment and be PCI certified, get a breach the next month. Yep. And PCI will immediately say, you're no longer PCI certified. You're going to have to go through certification again, because it is a point in time. All these assessments are a point in time. It's up to you to maintain them. And for HIPAA, you don't get treble charges on your penalties like you do in the False Claims Act. So that's something a little bit different between it. It's much more expensive.
Yep. That's right.
To hit false claims.
Yeah. So let's dive back into that a little bit more, right? Because I think that's an interesting aspect. Well, from your perspective, what does FCA exposure, what does that really look like? So we've seen cases, we've seen examples of this, right? What is that within the realms of what we're talking about here for CMMC? So.
Okay, sure. So let me go. I'm kind of a history nerd. So the False Claims Act, that came out actually around the Civil War, and that was used actually to prosecute suppliers that were giving the Union Army invalid invoices, and they still use it today. So it's been around since the 1860s, and it's still used today on basically anything you're misrepresenting to the government. So it's an anti-fraud tool out there. And if you knowingly submit a false claim for federal payment, you have suddenly hit the False Claims Act on there. So it is a civil law. It's not a criminal law, but obviously there are criminal laws around it. But this is a civil law that comes out. And so anytime you get any money for anything, for a grant, for a contract, and you misrepresent, you are subject to the False Claims Act. And it has treble damages, as I mentioned before. So it could be anywhere from $14,000 to $28,000 per claim. And a claim can be every time you submit an invoice, every time you sign your annual affirmation. So if you sign your annual affirmation and then you send 12 months of invoices, that is 13 separate claims they have against you if you're misrepresenting. So that's what the False Claims Act is. Now, what triggers it? If you get breached, they're probably going to look at you, but being breached doesn't always trigger it. The number one way people come in for False Claims Act right now is whistleblower. So as a whistleblower, I can get a percentage of what's charged. I think the largest whistleblower I've seen, somebody made $1.5 million by reporting their employer on there. And that is the main method of it going through. So you don't have to be breached. This can happen at any time. This is something you have to protect yourself from. And they don't have to prove that you had an intent to lie. They just have to prove that you misrepresented what you were doing on there. Yep. And so if you start looking, this is the False Claims Act. The DOJ is the one that generally enforces this on there. Now, we are seeing it. It has happened everywhere. This is not incredibly common where we see hundreds of cases a year, but they do actually go through and do this. So what we're seeing is, and I'm going to run through just a few companies. I took some notes on this that went out there. So there's a company called Morse Corp, and the SPRS scores, and we'll talk about that. An employee actually knew they were inflated, and so they reported them to get a percentage of the fines on there. Georgia Tech, so university, members of the cybersecurity team itself, the people running the program, reported it on there. Illinois Machine Shop is out there. A quality control manager who wasn't even in IT reported it, and they got charged, and they were a machine shop. They got charged almost $500,000 on there. So it doesn't matter how big or small you are. The fees aren't according to it. Like some of the different ones out there that go off a percentage of your revenue. This is not that. So if you're a small shop and you sign off and somebody disgruntled in your company or leaves your company or you let go, reports you, you could be fined your annual revenue or more than your annual revenue. So those are some examples. This is really, the reporting is an insider threat more than a breach. As Doug, you mentioned, primes can actually come after you and ask you to prove stuff. Just from your point of view, what have you seen with the primes doing on this versus actual insider threat?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and the primes in particular have a lot on their plate from a supplier management perspective, right? I mean, a lot of times we can look at this over, simplistically and say, yeah, we saw the notices that the Lockheeds or, some of the other providers put out there on the internet to say, all of our suppliers need to be CMMC, level 2. But if, there's a whole other but there are other tiers of supplier management within these large organizations, right? Companies that may not handle CUI today, but could, and the suppliers need to understand perhaps where they are on the path, and could this be a supplier that could handle CUI, and what would it take to get them to level 2? Things like that. So my only point there is that the supplier networks are far more complicated, even for mid-tier DIB companies, than just going through and saying, does everybody check the box from a CMMC perspective? I do think, though, that the supply, the super prime, the primes, obviously carry a lot of the liability when it comes to the overall contract vehicle, right? So they've got incentive to make sure that their suppliers are responsible, and it's not even just getting a fine from a False Claims Act. You're spot on, right? That can put a small sub out of business. But in addition, the you also have to you also have to consider the impact of what that business, that contract is, right? Because if a supplier or a sub, falsifies or misrepresents, information about their compliance and protection of CUI, that can work its way all the way up to DoD, DOW. So then you've got the greater contract is at risk as well. And so I think the prime contractors are definitely worried about this, because they know one way or the other they're going to get pulled in. They can't just point to the sub, right? And I don't even think they can just necessarily point to the sub and point to their CMMC certification. To your point, they need to be comfortable that there's an ongoing program there. So it's a lot that they're juggling right now. They've got a big job today. So.
And I will say, as you look at it, so the primes have people and money to run a program. They have subs. Those subs may have subs. And if you're a small machine shop, you don't have the resources as much as a prime does to validate that you have this program in place.
That's right.
And that's really when we start getting to people signing. So there is a personal liability that comes with the person that signs off on your annual affirmation, which we'll talk about in a bit. But when you're a smaller or a mid-sized shop, you may not have a GRC team, you may not have a governance or even a full security team on there, yet to handle any data that requires you to have a CMMC certification means that you are stating that you do have these programs in place.
That's right.
And there's, I think, 80,000 plus companies in the defense industrial base, and most of those will have to go through CMMC certification.
Yep.
A lot of those are very small companies that are signing something that's stating they are CMMC certified, but they may not have the resources in place to continue throughout the year going through all of the documentation, all the reviews, everything that you have to do to maintain CMMC. And those are the ones that when they start signing off, they can actually have the biggest risk. It could be an existential risk to the company because they are just much smaller. And this is something to think about when you sign off on this, which I'm sure a lot of smaller companies just want the revenue and they don't think about it. But once they have to start going through assessments, they realize, hey, if I sign this, I'm personally responsible for at least the misrepresentation I'm making.
Right.
I will say, and I'll just kind of run through like an assessment. When you get an assessment, it's a great start, because before you go through an assessment, you have to do a gap assessment. And this is, RKON does this all the time. We'll go through and say, this is what you need to have in place to get through an assessment. This is where you are now. Let's fix all these issues. So just to get through the CMMC certification means you've already fixed everything to get yourself to where you can get a passing score.
Mm-hmm.
And then, and I'm just going to reiterate this, a lot of companies don't foresee this as an ongoing thing that they're going to have to commit resources to the rest of the year to meet it on there. And when you get the certification, that's almost the easy part. It's not easy, but it's almost the easy part, because you've got to maintain it going on. And if they ever come back and let's say you have a whistleblower or for some other reasons you're investigated, you have to prove with documentation that you have everything in place and you didn't have risks that weren't addressed, everything going on. So that is just from a big picture.
Yep.
The big concerns I see is companies that are coming in and have to do it, they don't realize what they're committing to when they sign off on this.
So you bring up an interesting point. So certification itself, level 2 certification, became officially done last year, right? The year before that, we were doing them as joint voluntary surveillance audits. But the requirements for NIST 800-171 under DFARS have been in place for some time, right? The annual affirmations and things like that, those are things that have been in. That's not a net new thing, right? For CMMC, you are responsible for adhering, or because I don't think the annual affirmations is a net new thing, right? SPUR scores and those things, right? The contractors have been doing for some time. I will say that what we've seen that's interesting though is, and you brought up some very good examples for false claims, like the number. I wish I had it in front of me. The number of false claims acts in 2025 were like, what were they, like 20 or 30 times the number that they were in 2024, right? So they've stepped up. DOJ has stepped up in
It was
in
52
enforcement
million
on
last
this.
year.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, $52 million in dollars. I don't know if you remember or if you have what it was in 2024, but it was dwarfed. I remember going to I think it was CUI, CUICon, whatever you call it. There's an attorney there that presented, and it was the number of cases in 2025 was just astronomically higher than the number of cases in 2024. So we will continue to see that. I think the point I think we're trying to make, right, is the requirements are there, for working in the DIB and for handling CUI. And it's easy to say, well, they've always been there. And I know a lot that is true. But what's changed is not just the CMMC certification, right? It's the focus on this particular topic, the concern over theft of data, right? That was the, kind of the genesis for CMMC to come to place in the first place, right? Like more accountability for the contractors in terms of handling. The stakes are higher, I think, is really the main point. So.
Perfect. And I do want to move on, but for anybody that's listening, there is a comments section. If you have anything you want us to touch on, please feel free to put it in the comments. So, Doug, I want to go through some of the common gaps that you're seeing in companies' preparation and building of this environment. So I'll throw out a few: inflated SPURS scores, SSPs don't match reality, POAMs never close. There's a bunch of different things out there. What are you seeing a lot of?
Openly, we're, as you know, Shellman is assessment only, and we prefer to work with companies that have worked with advisory firms like yourselves to be able to prepare. That makes our lives a lot easier. But in essence, there always are companies that are rushing into this. They've got a contract vehicle that they want to get through by the November deadline, et cetera, et cetera. I think that the SSPs don't match reality, but I think that stems from the bigger problem, is that the scoping is not fully understood. Now, in certain cases, and this is a kudos to some of the MSP and other offerings that are out there, we are seeing a lot more enclaves being stood up, people recognizing that I want to make this CUI footprint as small as possible, but they still got to document it. And I think documenting it is the act, but you have to know it to document it, right? That's the issue with SSPs. It's not that they're failing a documentation exercise. It's that they're not necessarily accounting for everything that goes into it. Okay, great. You went out and deployed Microsoft GCC High, and you've got your SharePoint, you've got your separate email, SharePoint, et cetera, for all of the things that you interact with your primes, with the DoD, et cetera, right? You've got that. Oh, but what do you actually do for a living? Oh, we manufacture, parts, or, build out parts and manufacturing and welding. Well, how do you do that? Oh, we take the CAD, images from the design, and we put them into this machine, and the machine creates it. Like, well, are the CAD images CUI? I don't know. Well, you should know, right? And if they are, how are you, oh, well, the CAD images come from the, come from the prime, come from the designer, and we're just manufacturing the part. And okay, does it say CUI? Oh, yeah, I guess it does say CUI. Okay, how do you get it into the OT? How do you get it into the operation? How do you get it into that manufacturing technology? Right, and you've got to kind of walk through things like that. Now, there are companies that are simpler. They may be architecture, design firms, those types of law firms, professional services. Then your primary sources of data are in fact just your email and your collaboration tools. But those are the things. And again, like I said, that it's not that SSPs definitely have a wide range of quality, but the bigger issue is whether or not they've actually fully accounted for all of their scope, or if they're using external service providers. That's probably number two. Number two would be external service. They're using an external service provider that is or isn't FedRAMP. Maybe it is FedRAMP, but you didn't configure it the way that FedRAMP, that the customer responsibility matrix told you to configure in FedRAMP, right? And so that's another thing that we're seeing, and to a certain degree, it does elongate the assessment process a little bit. But I like the fact that CMMC has this phase 1 and phase 2 and phase 3, approach, right? You you have to go through a phase one where you can gate these things and you can say, hey, the documentation reflects the scope, all of which works pretty well. Looks good enough to audit, right, so to speak, as opposed to just what people kind of expect or think from like a SOC 2 perspective, where we're just going to jump in and start testing. So I don't know. That's what we're seeing. Curious what because you're coming in earlier than we are in many cases, right?
So we'll see. Scoping is a huge issue on there, and so a lot of people will come in and they'll be in Google Cloud, Azure, AWS, and they'll say that they have it handled. I have this in a cloud environment that's certified, and that's not the way it works. Really, that helps that you're using stuff, but you just mentioned GCC High and Microsoft. You can have a GovRamp, which is in a AWS, but AWS without GovRamp still has a certain rating. Same with GCP. So people come in with expectations on their scoping, what is in scope, what's not in scope, and then how to tie it together. And then CUI scoping is amazing, how people don't know what their CUI is, what you're protecting, because the government defines what CUI is. You don't define what CUI is.
That's right.
And when you get the data, you want to, if it's labeled CUI, it's CUI. At that point, you don't get to make a decision on that point.
Yeah, you can't argue it. The DOW says that our reports are CUI, so as a result, all C3PAOs have to have their own. We go through our own DIBCAC assessment, basically a CMMC assessment. We have to have our own environment, and it gets tested and audited as well. Because again, we're not handling designs or anything like that. We're not touching any of that data, but our reports are CUI. To your point, because the DOW said they were, right?
Yeah, so if they say it is, you don't really have the avenue to go back. But we only have a few minutes left, Doug. Yeah. So I want to leave people with key takeaways on this. I go jump into one. First thing is, I strongly recommend, because I do this all the time, doing independent gap assessment initially. Don't score yourself, because that's where people get in a lot of trouble. I guess trouble would be a bad word, but they end up thinking or doing groupthink, where they end up thinking something's going through and they don't have somebody independent looking at it, where they suddenly realize, hey, that with the way we're saying it's not going to meet this requirement. Sure. And then the second with that would be a self-disclosure. It's always better to self-disclose when you find something versus having a whistleblower go through, because that will go easily treble damages, where they can do single, maybe double damages when you self-disclose, and they can waive a lot of it. Doug, any thoughts?
You've hit it multiple times, but I mean, this is not a point in time this is not a point in time thing. It shouldn't be treated as a point in time thing to get a contract. You really have to commit to operating a program. And so with the clients that we've done certification work for, many of them are having us come back and do, even though it's not required, to do a health check, right, next year, because it gives them additional comfort when they're going to sign on that annual affirmation. It gives them additional comfort to know that the controls, have someone else look to see that the controls are operating effectively. So whether it's the independent C3PAO or an advisory firm like RKON, like get somebody to look at this on an annual basis, right, and make sure that you're not just, hey, this is great, we're certified, we'll see you in 3 years, because a lot can happen in 3 years, right? A lot of things change, and scope could change, and so forth as well.
If you're the one signing that affirmation, you're the name that they're looking at.
That's right. That's right.
With less than 1 minute left, Doug, real quick, how early should I reach out to C3PAO to do an assessment right now? I know everybody's striving to get level 2. So what are you guys seeing as far as legal?
Yeah, I mean, as early as possible is always the thing. We enjoy being, we enjoy being engaged and prefer being engaged, even if they're working with an advisory firm, like yourselves, right? Like we can ride alongside that during the preparation and be there and be teed up and ready to go. It's like, well, I'm going to wait until after, until after August or whenever, when my readiness is, when my consulting engagement is done, type of thing. Well, then you're battling for a very, very busy, September, October, right, leading up to November. And so, yeah, I mean, is the sooner rather than later to engage. And I also think that even if you're working through remediation with an advisor, it's a very powerful statement to be able to say, even if they're working, like let's say a subcontractor is working with a consulting firm like RKON to do remediation work, it's very powerful to say we're working with an advisory firm for remediation. We have already engaged the C3PAO to do the formal assessment once that is done. That's a very powerful message that you can send to your prime to be able to say, I've got this under control, right? This is my path to CMMC certification. Because then if it does go past November for whatever reason, right? And you remember, the November is where these start showing up in contracts. It's not like anyone's going to get fined for not being done in November, but you at least got a plan, right? And you've shown some, a methodical path to getting there. So
perfect. Well, thank you for that answer. And Doug, thanks for talking to me about this. So, all right, thanks everybody for attending.
Thank you.